Amid record high interest rates and a slowing economy, Russia's economy is showing increasing signs of near collapse. In fact, new concerns have now surfaced regarding the rising levels of bad debt or non-performing loans in the country, i.e. when a borrower is unable to make interest payments or is close to default. Now, borrowers struggling to repay puts more pressure on banks, which could lead to a wave of bankruptcies, which has sparked fears of a full-blown debt crisis. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why Russian banks are struggling and how likely a full-blown debt crisis really is. Could you rank every single politician in the world? Hear our thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, the World Leader Leaderboard. Find it on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. Let's get straight into the data. In 2022 and 2023, the number of non-performing loans was basically consistent, with a slight fall in 2023. However, last year this number suddenly jumped and has continued to rise for the first 4 months of this year too. Across the whole economy, the percentage of non-performing loans has risen by about 25% in the past 16 months, and about 50% in manufacturing industries. Russia's second largest bank, VTB, recently reported that the share of non-performing loans, which haven't been serviced for over 90 days, reached 5% in May, and could rise to between 6 and 7% in the next few months. This is below the 8% peak that VTB saw during the 2014-15 banking crisis, but it's above the normal average of 4%, and has created some anxiety about a credit event risk, like a bank run, which will be far more sudden and disruptive than the slow-burning issues already afflicting the Russian economy, like inflation. So, where has this emerging debt crisis actually come from? Well, the way we see it, there are at least 3 reasons why servicing debt has been made extremely difficult. First, the super high interest rates imposed by the Russian central bank to tamp down inflation. Driven by high military spending, inflation has risen steadily over the past 2 years or so, from a low of 2.3% in early 2023 to a high of 9.5% in December. The Russian central bank duly hiked its benchmark interest rate from 7.5% in early 2023 to an all-time high of 21% in October 2024. There was a 1-point cut to 20% last month, motivated by anxieties that the Russian economy might be nearing recession, but a 20% interest rate is obviously still super high. For context, benchmark interest rates in the US and UK are currently at 4.5 and 4.25% respectively, and most people already consider this uncomfortably high. Now, high interest rates make issuing new debt and servicing pre-existing debt more expensive. In Q1 of 2025 alone, Russian companies paid $48.5 billion in interest, a 58% jump year on year. By year-end, interest rate costs are expected to top $172 billion, more than double what they were in 2023. The Kremlin has also made things worse with its dodgy loan practices, forcing banks to lend more money to defense companies. For context, in order to both cover and downplay the Kremlin's mounting war costs, the Kremlin has essentially created a 2-track economy. In February 2022, just days after the invasion, the Kremlin enacted a law requiring Russian banks to extend preferential loans to war-related businesses on terms set by the state. Essentially, what this means is that the Kremlin is apparently forcing Russian banks to lend money to war-related companies at favorable rates. This created a 50% surge in corporate lending, over $415 billion, much of it to companies involved in the war effort. The problem here is that this has forced Russian banks to lend to uncreditworthy companies. In other words, unlikely to pay the loan back or with a higher chance of default. In fact, the sectors facing the highest levels of bad debt are defense-related: coal mining, machinery repair and installation, metallurgy, as well as rail, ship, and aircraft construction. The coal mining industry is under particularly severe pressure here, projected to hit $19.5 billion worth of debt by the end of 2025. The third and final reason for Russia's debt crisis is that, as we mentioned a second ago, in the context of that interest rate cut, the Russian economy is slowing down. This has become evident in the most recent GDP growth figures that shows GDP slowing to 1.4% year on year in this year's first quarter, the lowest quarterly figure in 2 years. While military-related industries have benefited, other sectors and businesses face weak demand, lower prices for exports, and additional costs caused by sanctions, and as such are losing out on business. For instance, in the first 4 months of this year, output by most civilian manufacturing industries shrank, while 13 of the 78 largest firms in Russia have been flagged as fiscally distressed. This general slowdown is more bad news for indebted companies because it means less demand and therefore less revenues. So what could happen next? Well, more non-performing loans means an increased risk of depositor flight. Because if depositors get worried that their bank doesn't actually have their cash and withdraw their money, that will put more strain on banks' finances and potentially trigger a bank run. A key indicator for the risk of depositor flight stands at 0.6, just above the danger threshold of 0.5, a level only seen a handful of times before, including right after the invasion, when the population withdrew almost 3 trillion rubles from banks in just 10 days. With that being said, a proper bank run and financial crisis does still seem unlikely, for at least 2 reasons. First, Russia has a lot of fiscal space to bail out any afflicted banks. Public debt is just 16% of GDP, and the budget deficit is below 2%, and Russia has about $690 billion of foreign reserves. Second, while corporate debt is rising, the total amount of non-financial corporate debt is still pretty moderate and has now started to slowly decline, while the amount of loans being issued also seems to be slowing down, decreasing by 0.1% in the first quarter of 2025 when compared to the previous quarters, and the central bank forecasts even further slowdowns for 2025. Nonetheless, even if this does reduce the risk of a debt crisis, fewer loans will also mean weaker GDP growth. This will put the central bank in a difficult position. Inflation is still running at 9%, so the central bank will be reluctant to cut rates any further. But super high interest rates are clearly slowing down the wider economy, and rate cuts might well be necessary in order to avoid recession. Ultimately, this was always a risk with the military Keynesianism policy that the Kremlin has pursued since 2022. In practice, this has basically involved running the economy hot, spending and lending lots of money to keep the economy chugging over, despite ever-escalating Western sanctions. Now, this worked remarkably well, but you can only run an economy hot for so long, and the Russian economy, with stubbornly high inflation, slowing GDP, and now a debt crisis, looks like it's finally overheating. All in all, while Russia's debt crisis might not explode overnight, it's starting to drag down the economy, leaving the central bank with an unenviable dilemma. More broadly though, it really does feel like we're in a period of political change at the moment. Gone are the days of predictable geopolitics, with Trump's America taking increasingly dramatic turns, so much so that it feels that America's influence, popularity, and dominance are all on the decline. So in the next issue of our magazine, Too Long, we're discussing this shift, and the potential that we're currently observing the end of the American order. In that section of the magazine, we discuss our thoughts on everything from the collapse of democratic norms to if America is losing allies, and if the country can maintain its dominance in energy and tech, before discussing who could potentially take over in a post-American world. So if you want to find out what we really think about America, now's your chance. It's not just the US either though. This issue is our longest ever at 78 pages. So we also get into stories like why El Salvador and Kosovo are becoming the world's penal colonies, if the UK is lacking vision at the moment, if Europe can really defend itself, and why leaders like Putin and Netanyahu seem to be getting away with it. Plus, we also have a full interview with Professor James Kerr-Lindsay, who you might also know from YouTube, all about the collapse of the global order. Now, if that all sounds good to you, but you'd rather listen than read along, then you should check out the premium edition. Because anyone who buys a premium edition of our magazine also gets access to our recordings of selected articles. Plus, you also get access to the full 90-minute interview with James Kerr-Lindsay. On top of that, premium subscribers also get access to our behind-the-scenes podcast, The Bullpen. Regardless of whether you opt for the regular or premium edition, if you never want to miss an issue, then make sure you subscribe to Too Long, which gets you 20% off every copy as long as you stay subscribed. Plus, this week only, if you use the code BESTOFFER when signing up for a subscription, you'll get an additional 35% off. That brings down the cost as low as £5.20, or a wild 48% off. That is the best offer we are ever going to offer. So pre-order your copy today to get yourself that extra content and support all of the journalism we do here at TLDR every single day.